Thank you.
Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. I applaud your and the President's efforts to condemn Hamas's invasion on October 7th, to secure a ceasefire, and to secure the release of hostages. President Biden has also recognized, however, that the campaign carried out by the Netanyahu government in Gaza has included what the President's called indiscriminate bombing, resulted in a massive number of civilian casualties. The NSM 20 report concluded, and I quote, "Given Israel's significant reliance on U.S.-made defense articles, it's reasonable to assess that Israel has used U.S.-provided weapons in instances inconsistent with international humanitarian law." Given this assessment, why did the State Department conclude that Israel's assurances that it was not using weapons in a manner inconsistent with international law are in fact credible and reliable?
Thank you, Senator. We've said two things from day one since October 7th. One, that Israel not only has the right, it has the obligation to defend itself and to try to make sure that October 7th never happens again. And the United States is committed to doing everything we can to support it in those efforts. We've also said that the way Israel does it matters, particularly with regard to civilian protection in Gaza and the provision of humanitarian assistance to Gazans who need it. And we have been working every single day since then, not only to provide Israel with what it needs, but also to do our best to help see that Palestinians get what they need in Gaza. And we see the horrific suffering of children, women, and men who've been caught in a crossfire of Hamas's making for 8 months now. And we are working every day to try to alleviate that. When it comes to the NSM and the use of our weapons, here's what the report said. It said exactly as you quoted. Given the totality of the damage that's been done, and given the fact that we are a major provider of weapons to Israel, it is reasonable to assess that in some instances, Israel has acted in ways that are not consistent with international humanitarian law. And indeed, we are investigating a number of instances, some of which are alluded to in the report, others that are not, to make those determinations. Israel itself is investigating hundreds of incidents to make its own determinations. And indeed, there are criminal investigations underway in Israel in this area. It's very difficult to make final determinations in the midst of a war when we do not have access on the ground, and when you have a almost totally unique battlefield where an enemy, a terrorist organization, Hamas, is hiding behind and underneath civilians in apartment buildings, in mosques, in schools, and firing at the Israeli forces. So we're determined to make every appropriate determination. We're determined that there be no double standard. We have processes at the State Department, including our conventional arms transfer policy, including our deterrent process that we're engaged in.
I know that it's so complicated that you could go on for a while, but I think you've pointed out the challenge and the fact that assessments are ongoing. I do feel it's important that we approach these questions in NSM 20 with as much integrity as possible. On May 7th, President Biden announced his decision to pause the shipment of the 502,000 bombs. And the following day, he drew a red line stating that, quote, "If Israel goes into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities." And you, Mr. Secretary, reinforced this point when you said, if Israel launches a major military operation into Rafah, then there are systems we're not going to be supporting and supplying for that operation. We are already seeing significant action in Rafah. About 1 million people have fled the city. Is the President going to stand by his red line?
First, the President stands behind the proposition that we will always make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself. No one has done more, not only throughout his career, but over the last 8 or so months to make sure that that's the case, and that will continue. At the same time, when it comes to Rafah, we've been very clear in many conversations with Israeli leadership over the past months about our deep concerns about a major military operation in Rafah and the impact that that would have on civilians in Gaza. We insisted that if anything is to go forward, we see a clear, credible plan to get civilians out of harm's way, but not only to get them out of harm's way, to make sure that they're provided for when they're out of harm's way. Now, you mentioned we've seen a very large exodus of people from Rafah, but they are now in places where they don't have the support that they need and that we believe is critical to provide. We also remain very concerned about any major military operation and the impact it would have on the remaining population, given the dense urban environment in Rafah and what we've seen in other places. And so the President's been clear about this with Israel, in public as well as in conversations with others, about the fact that we will not support a major military operation.
Thank you, and that's helpful to understand. I wanted to turn to the issue of providing aid in the situation of the challenge of food and water and medical supplies and so forth. The NSM 20 report noted that action and inaction by Israel contributed significantly to a lack of sustained and predictable delivery of needed assistance at scale, and that the level reaching Palestinian civilians remains insufficient. Insufficient is a very polite way, given that we now have what Cindy McCain has described as full-blown famine in the north, and we're all very aware of the highly stressed conditions in the south as well. As a result of the restrictions that Israel has had in place, we have been urging them, you all have been urging them, and I applaud that, to open more gates, to have a more systematic inspection process so far more trucks per day can get in, to make sure that once the trucks are through the gate, that they can actually get to the warehouses without being attacked or so forth. You've also supported air deliveries by ourselves and by other nations. You've also built a dock. All these things are in response to the restriction of aid. And thus, I was somewhat puzzled that the report concludes we do not assess that the Israeli government is prohibiting or otherwise restricting the transport and delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance. Because it seems like all those actions we're taking, the urging of Israel to do more, and all the other air delivery and docks and so forth are all a response to the restrictions preventing sufficient aid to get in and creating famine conditions affecting a couple million people.
If you could respond briefly.
Yes. First, Senator, there is no doubt that the people of Gaza, children, women, men, are experiencing an acute humanitarian crisis. And food, water, medicine, shelter, all of these things are in severe short supply. And we've been working every single day as well since October 7th to try to make sure that they could get what they need. And we have impressed upon Israel time and again the imperative of really bringing a determined focus to this, not making it an afterthought in the conduct of the war against Hamas, but an absolute priority. They've taken steps over these many months to open access points, going back to October, to have aid go in, but it has not been sufficient by far to meet the need. We saw much more significant progress over the last month or 6 weeks, particularly in the wake of a phone call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu in early April, where we saw more access points opening. We saw a land route from Jordan being activated. We saw openings in the north, which was critical because aid to North Gaza was particularly deficient. That's improved. But now we've seen, unfortunately, the reverse. Because of the actions in and around Rafah, we see the critical transit points in the south, Rafah Gate itself, as well as Kerem Shalom, until recently being stopped or disrupted, so that the situation in the south now risks being even more egregious. But the restrictions that have been in place, in some cases, it's because of concerns about dual-use items and making sure that Israel could see and verify what was going in, given the history of dual use. In some instances, it's because of the war conditions that make it incredibly difficult. But there are also things that Israel can, should, and must do to further facilitate the distribution of aid, including much more effective deconfliction with those who are providing it. So convoys that are bringing the aid in can go about their work safely and securely. That remains insufficient.
Senator Paul.
Secretary Blinken, on your recent trip to China, a news report